You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Ilaria Maselli, Senior Economist at the Conference Board, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Indications podcast, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I will be sitting down with my colleague David Hoffman, Senior Vice President Asia and leader of our China Center, to discuss some of the insights from the work of the last weeks, where we tried to answer questions like, how deep is the economic shock caused by COVID in China right now? What is the nature of the Sino-Russian relation? And what can we expect on Taiwan? David, I'm really excited to have you today. How are you?
I'm great, Ilaria. It's really nice to be here.
Fantastic. Well, let's get started with COVID, because where I sit, which is in Brussels, COVID seems to be forgotten, while right now it's the main shock in China. And it's the 25th of May today that we're recording this podcast. And I see from the data that the number of cases went down, but I understand that many restrictions in large cities are still in place. Why is that? What is happening?
Yeah, that's true, Ilaria. China has adopted what they call a zero COVID policy or a dynamic zero COVID policy, which basically utilizes lockdowns and physical distancing restrictions as the main way to combat and contain COVID. This worked very well enough, I guess, in Q1 2020 when China experienced its first outbreak in Wuhan and Hubei province. This time around, it's not working so well, and for one, Omicron is a much more transmissible variant, and whether or not any sort of physical restriction or containment approach against it can work is a major question. Nonetheless, China's employing this policy approach to try to contain the outbreak, and this is resulting in very significant city-level shutdowns across the country. Shanghai most prolifically, but probably affecting upwards of 40 or more other Chinese cities as well. Our expectation, unfortunately, is that China will continue with this policy approach.
That was my next question, indeed.
Okay.
Like, you don't expect that to come to an end, basically.
No, we don't expect it, or at least I don't expect it to come to an end. We published a piece in February a few months ago explaining why we thought zero COVID would remain in place. Basically, the thesis is that when you sort of try to contain COVID, there are three considerations: economic, political, and public health. And in our view, the political economy considerations are paramount in China for a variety of reasons, not least the fact that containment in Wuhan in 2020 was so successful that it really became a main talking point of the Chinese Communist Party, insofar as China did very well and the rest of the world, importantly the United States and Europe, looked really disastrous by comparison. So there was a lot of online discussion, a lot of propaganda type communication about the superiority of the Chinese system as exemplified by China's success in containing COVID, whereas nowhere else in the world could do the same. And that narrative was really driven in over the course of now 2.5 years. So it's what I might call a narrative trap, where reversing course now to say, well, actually, it's not going to work so well this time around, and we need to sort of prepare for the worst, is just an untenable pivot for the political leadership of the country. And that is why we think this policy will be maintained indefinitely. And I'm expecting through probably 2023.
Got it. Definitely not good news for the expat community, which I understand is finding it increasingly difficult to live, of course, with so many restrictions for such a long time. What about the economic impact? I understand, from April data that they came out really weak, that there was a negative growth in industrial production and a double-digit contraction for retail sales, so quite a major negative signal on the short-term outlook. And from what I understand from the data is also that the labor market is really struggling to create enough jobs, especially in cities where the lockdowns are more restrictive, and youth unemployment is up, hours worked are down, and we have to keep in mind that they had not fully recovered from the 2020 COVID shock before this new one started. So quite a severe labor market situation. So I wonder, what do you expect in terms of recovery? When do you expect that to start, or how do you think it's going to go?
Well, right now we're just trying to figure out what the extent of economic damage from this might be. So from the Q1 2020 outbreak and subsequent shutdown of Wuhan and much of Hubei province, and so forth, we saw the first ever negative quarter on quarter growth rate registered in the history of that series, that data series in China. This stands to be much worse. And as you say, it conflates with downward trends across many important indicators, a very significant slowdown in the real estate sector, which has been a very significant driver of Chinese growth now for over 2 decades. There you're sort of gut punching about 20 to 25% of economic activity out of the economy. Of course, it's not all going away, but it was the most reliable driver of recovery in the past. It was the quickest spigot you could turn on to sort of reflate the economy. You flush the market with credit, developers pick up the credit, they buy the tracts of land from the city governments, they begin to build, and so on and so forth. You almost have a virtuous little circle there. That circle has ended, and that's a really important point here. Secondly, coming out of the Wuhan outbreak in 2020, when the rest of the world went through the chaos of uncontained COVID, um, China really picked up a major share of global exports, and the match of Chinese production to global demand at the time, where people were stuck in their homes and were fitting out home offices and wanted new home and audio entertainment centers and new computing equipment and so forth. That drove a lot of export demand from China, and China's economy has been benefiting since. We're now seeing that demand fall off quite considerably, given the fact that the rest of the world is emerging from COVID restrictions and getting back to purchasing consumer services, eating out, seeing movies, so on and so forth, and not buying the durables that they did when they were stuck in their home. So this is going to be a big blow. We'll really see the data begin to flow through this month. In May, we've already seen the weakness in April, but we expect this to be a very big hit. Again, if you look at it from a policy perspective, if China were to loosen its COVID containment policies, the impacts or the results are very well known. In fact, they're inevitable. We'd see a huge rise in case counts. And even with Omicron being an arguably less dangerous variant than Delta, for example, by virtue of the law of large numbers, China would inevitably experience a very high death rate. That tends, that plus, widespread illness tends to overrun hospital systems. It's done that everywhere. We've seen it everywhere. This is not a criticism of China or any sort of judgment focused on China, but we've seen what happens when COVID rages and really surges in a given location. That would necessarily happen in China too. That's what the government is trying to avoid, presumably to both protect public health, but also to limit or preempt the political instability that can be caused when citizens become really frustrated with their public health system. So that's what the government's trying to avoid. On the economic front, there is going to be damage, very significant damage, and you mentioned the notion of expats being very significantly affected by that, this, and that. That is true. But I think what the government probably thinks is that it can address those issues after the fact. Once COVID is contained, it can maybe issue new policies that will revive the economy, that will reopen the doors to Western investment, that will make China a more attractive location for expats, and so forth. You see what I mean? They think that that area is more fungible. They will have more options about what they can do policy wise, whereas opening right now and just letting COVID wreak its predictable havoc is an unacceptable outcome, and one where no policy, pivot can actually do anything. They're just at the, at the whim of the disease, and that's it. The way they're doing it, I think they hope that they can introduce policies that work to resolve some of the economic and reputational damage at some future point in time.
But despite that, I have the impression that the outlook for 2022 and for the recovery that will probably start during summer is not great. So external demand will not help because we are buying on this side of the world less goods since we can consume again services, and on the other hand, the housing market is not in great shape. So it means that two major drivers of growth in China will not support the recovery in the second half of the year, if I understand well.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think it was 2016, we wrote a white paper that's still available on the Conference Board website called "The Long Soft Fall in Chinese Growth." China's growth rate has been slowing for some time. Fundamentally, China suffers a productivity problem. Productivity is too low to sort of power a new stage in Chinese growth. China's has 840 million people in its population who are low wage, low education, that need to be retrained or reskilled or dealt with to move to a higher value added economy, certainly an information economy. This doesn't discount that China has an incredibly vibrant, high consuming economy with its 400 million or so people that enjoy Western middle class wealth levels or much higher. That's a very big market segment, but we often forget that the other 2/3 of the Chinese population are not there yet. And that's a big economic drag. So China has very significant economic challenges in front of it.
And it
And
doesn't look easier
it,
after
do-
this
it,
other
do-
COVID shock.
it doesn't look easier after this. It will only be harder. And looking at this from the view of our members, Ilaria, Western multinationals active in China, this counterintuitively spells opportunity. Experience since reform and opening up began in 1978 really do indicate that when economic stress is high, that is when policies tend to be more hospitable to foreign investors. You can think of it this way: when the needs are greater in China economically for foreign investors who bring quality investment, quality employment, quality tax payment, quality CSR activity, quality ecosystem development, um, it's times of economic difficulty actually when the doors are open the widest because the needs are greatest. So it's I often talk to business executives who look at the top line growth numbers and think, oh my goodness, the China opportunity is diminishing. The fact is that even amidst a major slowdown, if the doors are open wider to foreign investment, the market opportunity is bigger for foreign investors, multinationals active there, even though the top line growth rate is lower. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I never thought about it, but I think it's a key insight from this first part of the conversation. And David, I'm going to take you from one difficult topic to the other. So
Okay.
let me move to the to the next difficult topic, which is China and Russia. Um, we've seen in the past years that US-China relations have deteriorated, and similarly, more recently, EU-China relations have deteriorated. And at the same time, China-Russia relations have expanded to encompass an array of new trade and security partnership. So I would like to hear your view on what you think the nature of this relation is and how you think it will evolve.
Yeah. Well, China and Russia since 2001 have had a joint friendship that was formalized in this joint statement, actually a biannual joint statement, and the most recent one was issued on February 4th, um, just prior to the Beijing Winter Olympics. And it was a much longer document than normal, and it was much broader in its scope, and in particular included four clauses that Russia and China agreed or agree to joint opposition to NATO's expansion in Europe. They jointly oppose AUKUS, the US, UK, and Australian agreement to build and base US designed nuclear submarines in Australia. That's a fairly long term program that won't actually operationalize until 2040, at least, as I understand it. It explicitly provides a Chinese endorsement of Russia's demand for security guarantees in Europe, and an explicit Russian endorsement of China's position on Taiwan, the one China policy, essentially, that Taiwan is a sovereign territorial component of China proper. And that's new. These are new statements, but are not particularly um, inflammatory on their own. But they do indicate that there's a broadening understanding between China and Russia that there are areas where the two countries can work together in ways that serve their individual self-interests, and that are more powerful through the combination of the two. There's a lot of speculation about close personal relations between President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin himself. It's hard to really know how true those rumors are. I mean, nobody has insight into what these two leaders actually really think and feel at their level. So that one I basically discount. When I look at the relationship in general, I see that China, can gain certainly some military advice as it works to modernize its People's Liberation Army, and modernize its military capability. There's something there that they can learn from Russia. There's also commodity and food supplies that benefit China from a trade relationship. But other than this, there's not that much there, compared to the Chinese commercial relationship with Europe and the United States. Russia is, 1/10 or much less even than that. So, from an economic point of view, the real focus has to continue to be on keeping Western markets open to Chinese exports and to the Chinese innovation environment.
So, would you argue that China will try to maintain some sort of balance between its strategic interest um, vis-a-vis Russia and its economic interest vis-a-vis the rest?
I think so, and I think time will very likely show that we have overestimated the depth and extent of this new Sino-Russo friendship. That it was designed to satisfy a few explicit goals, that it's fairly narrow in scope, and that these parties have more areas that they they hold mutual concerns about one another than mutual synergies. And I think we will see China sort of reverse or attempt to reverse out of this notion that this is the new big geostrategic relationship that it is betting on for the long term. I think we're going to see a pivot precisely because the economic relationships with the West and with the rest of the world are incredibly important. And as the Ukraine crisis goes on, the war becomes uglier and uglier, Western sanctions become tougher and tougher, global resolve really resolve and sentiment towards Russia and everything related turns increasingly sour. I think we're going to see China stuck in a ever more difficult position. That's why I called our white paper on this topic the slippery slope.
And that's another interesting insight, David. I think now that we covered the zero-COVID policy, the economic impact from that in China, and relationship with Russia, I think we're going to take a short break and come back in 2 minutes with more. We will talk about Taiwan in a second.
Interested in more insights on the current Russian-Ukrainian crisis? Visit our geopolitics hub at conferenceboard.org/topics/geopolitics. Here you can find a range of easily accessible insights in the form of webcasts, podcasts, research briefs, and more. New resources are being added regularly to help you lead with confidence.
Welcome back. I'm here with David Hoffman, the center leader of our China Center, and I think we're going to talk about Taiwan now. I promised we would go from a difficult topic to another difficult topic, and I think in everyone's mind, Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, and then on February 25th, many observers were wondering whether the Chinese invasion of Taiwan would follow at some point. And you wrote recently, David, that you think the two cases are different, that you think that an invasion is unlikely, and I would like to ask you to explain why, to explain your point.
Thanks, Ilaria, and you're right. This just gets harder and harder. You're making me work too hard. From the February 4th statement of joint friendship issued by China and Russia, many analysts drew a straight line between what happened thereafter, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and China's designs for Taiwan. So that became sort of a prevailing view that China and Russia signed this joint treaty. Lo and behold, Russia unexpectedly invaded Ukraine. It's inevitable that China intends to do the same, and maybe this was what was really behind this joint statement of friendship, and so on and so forth. So the business executives we work with at the conference board were not surprisingly very concerned about this idea, and we're getting asked by their boards and their shareholders and others, what do you think of this? What are you doing about it? So the reason I wrote the piece was to try to address this fear, this uncertainty, and explain rationally why, if you look at things kind of in their totality, even if you assumed that mainland China had hostile intentions for Taiwan, the timing and everything else just didn't make sense, all things considered. So the purpose of the piece was to try to give business leaders the background and framework they needed to make rational decisions about the risk levels involved here of a mainland China similar mainland China type invasion of Taiwan, as we're seeing in Ukraine. And that's what the paper tried to address. And in my view, China is unlikely to adopt a similar approach. If ever it actually adopts a hostile approach towards Taiwan reunification, it's very unlikely to adopt a similar approach, and it's incredibly unlikely to do so now, for a variety of reasons.
And I'm going to ask you what are the 3 reasons that you mentioned in the paper. But I would like to tell our listeners that they can find the paper on our website. So if you go conference board / geopolitics, you will find the piece we're talking about there. So back to you, David. What are the reasons why you think this is unlikely?
Well, 3 primary reasons. And again, this was really just to refute this idea that there was a straight line between Ukraine and Russia and mainland China and Taiwan, and that one necessarily presaged the other. So the paper was designed to address this specific um, idea that was really a prevailing idea in the business and policy community at the time. I think it's sort of changed now, and it's no longer the number one concern kind of in Asia, or certainly for multinational business in China. But the 3 reasons here are thus. Firstly, even by its own account, China does not have the combined force military capability to mount an invasion and occupation type um, operation vis-a-vis Taiwan. So a combined force operation means that you bring together, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, rocket, information, everything into one consolidated and organized initiative. China only began really reforming its People's Liberation Army, the PLA, about 10 years ago. It's made a lot of progress. But prior to that, it was all Army, Ilaria. It was the People's Liberation Army, and it was all about armed forces and tank forces protecting China's homeland. The Air Force and Navy were pretty undeveloped, and they were subservient to the Army. It was called the Navy of the People's Liberation Army, in fact. So Xi Jinping has undertaken to change this, to create a joint force capability, which requires, redoing all the lines of command. Not an easy thing to do in a very highly political and sensitive organization of about 2 million people in China, or in the PLA. So that
So
has
they're
been.
not there yet.
No, they're not there yet, and they are getting there. But even by their own reckoning, they won't be there until 2027 at the earliest, and the previous goal was 2035. So that's one pillar of this. The second is that China is much likely to act on Taiwan in a hostile way when the West is unified and coordinated. And right now, the West is, as a result of Ukraine and the response that's been required there. So it may have been the fact that pre-Ukraine, the West was disunited and disorganized, that NATO was sort of listing, if you will. That's all changed. So from a timing perspective, now is not a good time, if ever there was one. And last but not least, the sanctions that have been put on Russia would be utterly devastating for China, which is a much more globally connected economy. Now, people who hold different views would say, well, that makes the chance of, similar sanctions being imposed on China that much more unlikely. But I see it otherwise. I mean, there are many now in the US government who want to automate these sanctions on China if hostile actions are taken against Taiwan. And when foreign relations rises to the level of war and military conflict, that's when military planners come in and mindsets change and ideas about commercial damage and economic damage become distant second thoughts. So I don't think it's the case that if, China does something similar to what Russia is doing towards Taiwan, that the US and Europe will somehow not impose sanctions on China because of the economic the collateral damage they will experience, or the mutual damage they will experience, is a reason why they therefore won't do this, is just irrational. Of course they will do it, and it would be devastating to China. We've already talked a little bit about the economic challenges ahead. The last thing the Chinese leadership wants to do now is weaken the economy to the point of, widespread poverty or and political instability. It just doesn't add up.
I take the point, David, but I'm gonna push back because I have a deja vu feeling. In 2016, there was the Brexit referendum. Okay, completely different scale, but the argument was um, the the UK will stay in the EU because, from the economic point of view, it doesn't make any sense to just create an artificial contraction of the economy,
Mhm.
which is actually what happened after the UK left the EU, and exports decline massively. It's very difficult for businesses to adapt. So why would the British people do this to themselves, and why would the government carry on with this idea of leaving the EU? So we all expected a rational reaction to this to the referendum, and it definitely didn't win, as we saw. So I wonder if the age of rationality is over, and other considerations, more political considerations, become stronger. You know, are there chances that China abandons its famous pragmatism?
Well, that's a very good question, and of course we we need to expect the unexpected, and history, at least the history of business, never rewards complacency. So businesses need to be prepared for gray swans and so forth. But it's basically unfalsifiable to have a point of view that we can only expect the unexpected, and there's no way to think rationally about these difficult issues. I mean, business has to think rationally about them, and they have to monitor gray swans and look at whether they're escalating or de-escalating, whether the impacts, whether the likelihoods are probable or improbable, whether the impacts would be small or large. They need some framework for doing this. So you're right. There's no way that we can say with 100% confidence that pragmatism will prevail. I would argue that in the example you used about Brexit, there was many more. There were a lot of other things involved. There are a lot more other things than would be involved, for example, in a decision made by the Chinese leadership to take early action, or earlier than expected action, or sudden action on Taiwan. So I take your point, and we think business needs to be prepared for the unexpected. There's no doubt about that. And but yet we do think that business needs to think about these gray swans in a rational way, try to estimate the costs and trade-offs involved, and make a judgment about how rational they expect the leadership to be. If China's economy was booming, if the external environment was divided and dysfunctional, if no one was paying attention to Taiwan, maybe China would choose a different course of action. But right now, you have a situation where the costs would be inestimable, where the fortitude of the West is, we can't say that the West would defend Taiwan, but certainly the Western position on Taiwan is more unified and stronger than it's been in years, and so on and so forth. So again, if you kind of add up these things on one side versus the costs of unlikely action on the Chinese side, you can reach a point where you at least feel more comfortable um, with charting a path over the near and medium term, and you don't get hamstrung into a situation where you're like, Chicken Little, the sky could be falling, and we just need to prepare for the worst, because that could happen at any time, and we just don't know when. You know what I mean? You've got to have some basis for business planning at this very difficult time.
Got it. I'm going to move to another difficult topic, which is decoupling from China, which is a topic I always end up discussing with conference board members. And before I ask you some questions, I would like to offer some data points from our recent work. So before the pandemic, we published a report where we observed that the share of foreign input in global manufacturing production was declining after 2011. And basically, this was reversing a trend of the previous 15 years. So what this data point said is that manufacturing already before the war in Ukraine and already before the US-China tensions was actually starting to become more local. And very, very recently, in the second half of April, we asked some questions on how CEOs in Europe see the future of their dependency on China. And we got some interesting results there. So let me give a few. So one is that a large majority of CEOs are accelerating their plans to find new suppliers within Europe, and they are also increasing. They're also increasing their investment to reinforce their capacity in Europe. Then we asked the question: so does that mean you want to reduce your dependency on Chinese suppliers? And well, not necessarily, because a third of CEOs says that they're trying to do that, but there was another 44% that said that reducing dependency on Chinese suppliers was not part of their supply chain strategy for the short term. And then for the long term, views were really divided, with 48% of CEOs in Europe expecting decoupling from China to accelerate in this new geopolitical environment, but another 46% expecting the decoupling to proceed at about the same speed, which is not very fast right now. So, David, you have a really privileged point of view to comment on this issue. What do you see happening? What do you expect in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so let me try to tie a few things together here. The Chinese and Western economies are deeply, deeply coupled. I don't think there's any debate about this, but in one of our China CEO Council meetings a few years ago, we just looked at the extent of coupling, if you will. And in China, you just have incredible scale in ecosystems that is going to be very difficult to replicate elsewhere. So decoupling for current generation products and services is going to be very slow and very costly, and it will require that sufficient new ecosystems of scale be built up slowly in other places, just as they were built up slowly in China over three decades. So that's the reality on the ground, and I think business is doing its best to figure out how to de-risk their supply chains, but also how to de-risk them on the Chinese side. So their Chinese customers want supply that is secure and controllable. So we see Western multinationals who are interested in developing the China market for their business, investing more and more in verticalized supply chains that are in China for China. They are also looking outside China to try to build more resiliency in their global supply chains to serve the rest of world that would satisfy the concerns of the US and EU governments about supply chain dependencies on China that could be weaponized in the case of, military conflict. So there are two things happening here. There is stronger coupling going on by Western companies in China to verticalize and localize supply chains to serve the Chinese market with supply chains that are better insulated from global trade policy, tariffs, and other things. And at the same time, these companies are decoupling insofar as they're building more resilience into their global supply chains outside of China. I think this is a sort of a fact that is just not well understood, that there are actually two things happening at the same time. It's not one or the other. We expect this to continue. We expect that tensions will remain high for a prolonged period. We don't expect that we'll see broad-based sanctions from either the US or EU imposed on China that will stop business from happening between China and the West. So we've seen sanctions and entity listings and Special 301 or Section 301 restrictions and so forth imposed on certain Chinese entities and individuals, but nothing that has been so broad-based as to actually stop commerce in any specific area. That's the scenario we expect to continue. A scenario of high tension, a persistently elevated tensions, but where business can continue nevertheless, although it's becoming more complicated and costly. Ultimately, if it becomes too complicated and too costly, we may then see business begin to shift its supply chain investment for next generation products to other locations where they can be free of those costs and complications. Does that make sense? So, more in China for China, but also more resilience built outside of China, to satisfy the requirements of US and European regulators and policymakers.
David, I have to thank you for this because, every other day you read articles on deglobalization and I find them often superficial. And what you are offering, what you're explaining, it's a high level of complexity, but actually a very good view on what is likely to what is happening right now and what is likely to happen in the next few years. So really, thank you for this. Thank you for sharing all your views and thoughts on these delicate and complex issues. And thanks everybody for following this program. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our Indications podcast series on any platform, or check our website conferenceboard.org/podcast or /geopolitics for our geopolitics hub. The links to the reports will be included in the show description, and I hope to see you soon next time.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.